The story takes place in the future, a few years after it last rained. Kendall is a teenage orphan who scrambles to find water for herself and her friend Dean. The two live on the Wallace farm, in a hidden part of the attic. Kendall always carries a weapon and never fails to check through her scope if each location is safe before approaching. Both her home and the surrounding farms are in a state of complete abandonment, and surviving there is becoming increasingly difficult. Still, every day Kendall sets aside a bit of her water in a jar and leaves it at the front door of the nearest neighbor. One day, she wakes up startled by the sound of strange people downstairs. Dean is also on high alert and the two prepare for the worst, each with their weapon. The voices get closer, complaining that there is no water to steal there. One of them says he will check the attic, but the others think it's a waste of time and leave. Through the scope, Kendall makes sure the intruders are far away before heading out for the daily collection. At one of the nearby farms, she gets startled when someone suddenly touches her hand and we see that her reflexes with the weapon are excellent. However, upon seeing that the stranger is very frail and begging for water, Kendall changes her attitude and gives her an almost full jar. The girl's name is Elizabeth, and she is heading to her sister's house, who lives across the valley and is not doing very well at the moment. In the middle of the conversation, there's a sound of gunfire outside, and Kendall quickly grabs her scope to spy. Two people are being executed by people wearing gas masks. Elizabeth says that Kendall shouldn't be standing still in one place because of people like that. They will continue ransacking the houses in the area and will find her sooner or later. Even if she manages to avoid that, there's also the issue of the well, which will run dry eventually. Without responding, Kendall hands a knife to Elizabeth and wishes her good luck on her journey to her sister. A little later, she meets her friend Gabriel, who also lives around there. The two are childhood friends and still remember when that area was green. Gabriel asks about Dean's health, but she doesn't want to talk about it and pushes him away when he tries to kiss her. After that, she heads to a spot where Gabriel thinks there might be news. There are many watchers around, and soon she understands why, as a water truck is arriving. That night, Kendall hears a girl calling for help over the radio. She says she is alone at Dover Farm and there is a masked man outside. Dean is surprised to see Kendall preparing to leave, and she explains the situation, saying she is going to help a girl. He thinks she shouldn't go, but he doesn't try to stop her. Arriving at the farm, she discovers that it's all a trap set by a man named Carson, who controls water consumption in the area. He is forcing the girl to make that appeal over the radio to lure people to the place. Since most of the wells in the area are dry, anyone alive is because they are stealing his water. When the girl begs him to free her family, he shoots one of them to show he is serious. Devastated, she realizes her end is not far off anyway. Therefore, she grabs the radio and starts shouting not to come, as it is a trap. The one administering her punishment is Carson's daughter, Brooke. Kendall waits until the group leaves before entering the room to see the horrible scene they left behind. Hearing someone coming back, she runs to hide again. One of the masked men is checking for survivors in the house. After he passes, Kendall closes the girl's eyes and quickly returns to her hiding spot upon hearing more gunshots. Carson is finishing the job, and Brooke notices that someone has closed the eyes of a victim, but he doesn't care much. The next day, Kendall takes the water jar to the neighbor and sits down to talk with him. Only then do we discover that he is just a child. His name is Albie, and Kendall wants him to come live with her too. Besides still having water in the well, she and Dean found a Cessna plane in good condition. As soon as they get the missing part, they will be able to escape the valley. However, the little boy prefers to stay alone there with the dry well, saying that is why his home is safe. Kendall doesn't insist and continues her daily task of scavenging everything around. At the orphanage, she gets emotional seeing the record of her name and Dean's on the same page. We also discover that he had a sister named Pia, who passed away some time ago. Arriving home, she has to deliver the bad news: the well is drying up. Dean wants her to leave without him because on her own she could go on foot. They just need the Cessna because Dean wouldn't be able to walk to his uncle's house, which is outside the valley. Kendall doesn't even want to hear about it and repeats that she will never leave him. Later, she hears someone from Birch Farm asking Carson for help. Again, Dean says she shouldn't leave, and he gets worried when she explains her reasons. She wants to see if everything will turn out well because maybe it's a good idea to join Carson for now. On the way there, Kendall is devastated to find Elizabeth lying on the ground, lifeless. The jar she gave her is empty and left a few meters before. Kendall retrieves her knife and continues walking to Birch Farm. That's where her friend Gabriel lives, who is digging a grave for one of his relatives. His whole family is around, and a woman named Grace begins to talk to Kendall. She says she can't stand living in fear since her well dried up. Moreover, many of the family are elderly or sick. Carson has many resources in his shelter, but he only shares them with his loyal allies. He even started distributing flyers inviting people to take refuge in his hideout. Gabriel tells Kendall she should come with them because Carson could help Dean. Without judging the family's decision, Kendall only responds that she has other options. Grace is amazed that the girl still has faith and says she can take the little water left on their farm. She is filling her canteen when Carson arrives with his usual crew, Brooke and the masked people. The agreement for the initial meeting is that the refugees leave all their weapons visible as a show of goodwill. Without dropping her own rifle, Kendall remains hidden inside the house, peeking through the window. Carson makes a solemn prayer before starting to shoot everyone. Gabriel is the only one spared, as he is still young and can be useful. Carson asks him if there is anyone else at the farm, making it clear that lies will not be forgiven. After a moment of hesitation, the boy says there is one more person. Kendall tries to hide better while Carson orders the masked men to use the heat sensor to detect her presence. Through a crack in the wall, she sees her enemy talking to his daughter. The two speak about these atrocities as if they were commonplace and justifiable, saying that this way the poor suffer less. When the masked men fill the house with gas, Kendall covers her face with her clothes and is surprised to discover that Gabriel actually ratted out another person who was also hiding on the farm. Carson asks if there is anyone else, and the boy assures there isn't. Kendall bolts at the first opportunity and ends up running into one of the masked men who was watching. The girl is quicker with her weapon, but nothing happens when she pulls the trigger. In the scuffle, she is the one who gets the worst of it and her head starts ringing after a blow to the temple. The masked man begins to drag her, but she hits him with the axe in the middle of his back. Then Kendall manages to grab the gun before he recovers, and this time it works. Kendall collects her axe and leaves, stopping at Albie's door to rest. Now the well has completely dried up, but she lies to Dean, saying the pump is just a little slow. He says he knows why this is happening and explains his theory. Carson is draining the region's aquifer, sucking water from everyone to his shelter until he has total control over the valley. This makes them even more determined to make the plane work and get out of there. The next day, Dean visits his sister Pia's grave to say goodbye. He tells Kendall that when his time comes, he wants to be cremated. After they come back home, Kendall is going out when she notices that one of Carson's men is standing with his back a few meters away. She hides, but ends up making noise, and the man begins to investigate. The candy she made for Dean is completely exposed, and she doesn't want the stranger to discover that there are people living there. As she shifts position to reach the jar, she sees that Carson's crew is already almost at the door. The one dressed as a priest begins to call her, referring to Kendall as the murderer who left one of them in the desert without even the dignity of a burial. She keeps switching hiding spots as they enter with their devices to detect heat. For now, no one has noticed the fallen lid of the jar on the porch. Kendall manages to climb to the attic, where Dean is already bundled up in aluminum foil to fool the detector. The voices downstairs are getting closer, and the devices begin to beep as if they have found something. A single shot is fired, but then everything goes quiet again, and the two realize that no one has entered yet. Peeking through a hole, she sees one of the masked men explaining to Carson that it was a false positive because the sun beats directly on one part of the ground all day long. They decide to leave, but Carson thinks it would be better to fill the attic with gas just to be on the safe side. Kendall and Dean are also prepared for this and put on their own masks. Carson's men post one of those flyers on the door, and Brooke finds the jar lid, but says nothing. After they leave, Kendall sees that Dean is not feeling well and goes to fetch water for him. More concerned about her friend's health, Kendall decides it's time to make that plane work. She intends to steal the part from one of Carson's cars, but the entrance to the refuge is always guarded by the masked men. Right now, one of them is camouflaged in a pile of sand right behind her, and Kendall doesn't realize when he quietly rises. Suddenly grabbed by her hair, she kicks the assailant's foot to free herself and then shoots twice. Running to Albie's house, she finds him under a car, and the two talk about the situation. The boy says Kendall is not helping much, as Carson always shows up at his house right after she visits. Upset, she promises that she will come to get him when she leaves with Dean and that the three of them will be fine, but Albie says promises mean nothing. At home, Dean looks so weak that Kendall has to use a mirror to check if he is still breathing. The next day, she sees three nomads approaching in search of water. She tells Dean that it's better to wait until they give up, but he convinces her to help them. There are two men and a woman who looks like she is at death's door. They get frightened when Kendall steps out of the house armed and swear they came in peace. Their farm was destroyed by Carson, and only the three managed to escape knowing he wouldn't provide shelter to weak people. Their appearance matches the story, but Kendall shows she doesn't trust anyone. She makes the nomads walk to a specific spot and tosses a canteen to them, making it clear they need to leave after quenching their thirst. The three eagerly share the jar, and one of them asks Kendall how many people are in her group. She lies and says she is alone, and the woman invites her to join them, trying to thank her for her kindness. She declines the offer without further explanation and repeats that the three need to leave now. Later, Dean realizes she is lying to him about the well. She then confesses the truth: the water they have will last at most a week. They need to find the missing piece before then, but the only place she hasn't searched yet is Carson's refuge, and she doesn't know how to approach it without being seen. It is then that Dean has an idea and says they need to resort to the most terrible thing in a world without water: fire. With a slingshot, Kendall manages to start a small fire that diverts everyone's attention. While they put out the flames and Carson shouts orders, she steals the part from one of the parked jeeps and leaves as quickly as possible. On the way back, she compares the diameter to Dean's drawing and smiles upon seeing that she finally got the correct size. She arrives home and shares the good news with Dean, already making preparations for the trip. Handing a canteen to her friend, she tells him he can drink as much as he wants. However, as soon as she goes out to fill another jar, the three nomads ambush her. Kendall is tied up and gagged while the invaders take long gulps of her water. Saying there isn't enough for one more person, they decide to finish her off. But before that happens, Dean shoots the woman and one of the men. The other manages to knock the boy down but ends up being shot shortly after. However, the gunshots alert Carson, and Kendall sees he is already almost there. Dean only has time to help her hide inside a car before finding himself surrounded by the enemies. Carson asks him about the shots, and he says it was a dispute over the remaining water since the well just dried up. Inside the car, Kendall tries to loosen her hands while Dean does what he can to stall Carson. But when he sees Brooke and a masked man heading to the barn, Dean starts shooting. He manages to take out one of the masked men and hit another in the shoulder before being executed. Kendall watches everything from inside the car and struggles to stifle her sobs. As the henchman who was wounded is no longer useful to Carson, the priest eliminates him right there. Then the group begins to ransack the house, destroying everything they don't want to take. When they are satisfied, Carson and Brooke warn that they will begin work on the next farms while the priest marks this one as theirs. Kendall remains curled up under the tarp until the silence returns and then escapes through the back of the barn. Nearly fainting under the scorching sun, she walks to Birch Farm and stirs the sand over the recent graves until she finds a sword. The priest is watching the door of the house, and he is the first to succumb. Kendall is so quick that he doesn't even have time to use the weapon to defend himself, and she takes the opportunity to load her own with his ammunition. Two masked men are coming down the stairs when she enters the house and shoots each of them. Removing their masks, Kendall is shaken to see that one of them is Gabriel. After that, she returns home and obeys Dean's last wish, putting his body inside before setting fire to the farm. The next morning, she fits the piece into the plane's engine and goes to fetch Albie as promised. However, as soon as she sees Carson's flyer posted on the door, she understands that the boy has been kidnapped. Running to the entrance of the refuge, she sees Albie on the other side of the fence, closely watched by Brooke. Kendall throws the sword and the gun over the fence and dives into a puddle of mud, emerging on the other side. She approaches the sheds cautiously until several men approach. Then Kendall begins to take down all the henchmen by shooting. When Carson finally appears with his daughter, he is shot in the arm, and Kendall hits Brooke in the shoulder before realizing her bullets have run out. She uses the sword to finish off the last henchman while Carson helps his daughter to her feet. He tells Brooke that she has nothing to worry about, as the entire valley will be hers in the future. Then he lunges at Kendall with a machete, but she easily wins the duel. Challenging the intruder, Brooke grabs the machete and says that now it's just the two of them left. Albie hides in a corner, watching the fight between them. Since Brooke is much more agile than her father, the fight against her is tougher, and Kendall can't dodge in time before the enemy grabs her hair. She bangs Kendall's head against a wall several times before applying a chokehold that nearly suffocates her. But then Kendall headbutts her face and breaks free from the hold, knocking Brooke down and relentlessly striking her wounded shoulder. When Kendall raises the knife, Brooke tries to defend herself with her arm and gets hit in the wrist. She reaches for the axe with her other hand but has no strength left to use it. With her sword, Kendall finally finishes off her enemy once and for all. Finally free, Kendall and Albie walk to the plane. The boy asks if they aren't going to look for Dean, and Kendall only responds that her friend will be left behind. Then they start the plane, ready to finally leave that place.